All right, we're looking at the subject of Palestine and the many misconceptions and the historical realities of that area of the world. We looked at the section here, Who is to Blame? Talks about in 1956, Ahmed Shukriari testified to the UN Security Council it is common knowledge that Palestine is nothing but southern Syria. Common knowledge. 8 years later, in 1964, he's an Egyptian, Shukriari, became the first leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, later headed by Arafat. That's puzzling. Common knowledge is just part of Syria. Why are we having a Palestinian Liberation Organization formed? He is also not a Palestinian, but was born in Cairo on August 4, 1929. So we move on with these inconsistencies that people seem to believe without checking them out. We left off at this spot here. Satanic hatred of Jews did not end with Hitler, but is growing in intensity, not only in the Muslim world, but also in Europe and in America and elsewhere today. However, nowhere is anti-Semitism more clearly and vehemently manifest than in Islam. Every child in the Palestinian Authority schools reads the textbook, Our Country Palestine. Its title page declares there is no alternative to destroying Israel. Muhammad said, the last day will not come until the Muslims confront the Jews and the Muslims destroy them. In that day Allah will give a voice to the rocks and the trees, and they will cry out, Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him. No clearer declaration of Satan's passion could be made. There we see the true face of Islam, the religion of peace. Immediately after signing the Oslo Accords in 1993, Arafat began to tell Muslim audiences around the world not to accuse him of betraying their sacred cause by making real peace with Israel, but to realize that he was following the example of their prophet Muhammad. Otherwise, he would have suffered the same fate as Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, who visited Jerusalem, signed a peace treaty with Israel, and for that betrayal of Islam was assassinated by the Muslim Brotherhood. In AD 628, Muhammad had signed with the Quraysh of Mecca a 10-year ceasefire known as the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Such a hudna is a pretense entered into when Islamic forces are not strong enough to engage the enemy, and exists only to gain a strategic advantage for destroying the enemy. This is the law of war and peace in Islam, which no Muslim leader can abrogate. Muhammad declared, Allah has commanded me to fight against all people until all acknowledge there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. The entire world is divided into Dar el-Islam, the house of peace, and Dar el-Harb, the house of war. And there is a perpetual jihad until all mankind are in submission to Islam and Allah. No Muslim leader has the authority to bring an end to the jihad, a holy war between Islam and the rest of the world. Thus, when Arafat and other Arab leaders speak of peace, they actually mean a hudna. President Jimmy Carter persuaded Israel to give back the Sinai, though it never belonged to Egypt, and brought Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin together at the White House to sign a peace treaty between their two countries. Carter, an ecumenist for whom the Book of Mormon or Quran is as valid as the Bible, wanted to quote one verse each from the Bible and Quran. There are more than 400 such references in the Bible, but Carter's speechwriters searched long and hard in order to find in the Quran, which has more than 100 verses about fighting and killing to take over the world for Allah, one verse about peace. They finally found it, Surah 861. Each of the 114 surahs chapters has a heading. The title of Surah 8 is Spoils of War. Chapters about fighting, slaughter, and plunder in the cause of Islam. Fight them until all religion is for Allah. O Prophet, exhort the believers to fight. It is not for any prophet to have captives until he hath made slaughter in the land. With great enthusiasm, Carter quoted the lone peace verse in the Quran. But if the enemy inclined towards peace, surrenders, do thou also incline towards peace. So each of the 114 surahs or chapters has a heading. The title of Surah 8 is Spoils of War. The chapter is about fighting, slaughter, and plunder in the cause of Islam. Fight them until all religion is for Allah. O Prophet, exhort the believers to fight. It is not for any prophet to have captives until he hath made slaughter in the land. With great enthusiasm, Carter quoted the lone peace verse in the Quran, but if the enemy inclined towards peace or surrenders, do also incline towards peace. He should have known that the Muslim has an entirely different idea of peace from the rest of the world. As Arafat has bluntly said, peace for us is the destruction of Israel. What naivete could cause Carter to imagine peace between Islam and Israel? He surely knew of the literally hundreds of pronouncements of destruction upon Israel, both in the Quran itself and by Muslim leaders. Over BBC Radio, May 15, 1948, the day after Israel declared its independence, Azam Pasha, Secretary General of the Arab League, had declared, "This will be a war of extermination and momentous massacre, which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacres." On May 20, 1967, Hafez Assad, at the time Syrian Defense Minister, had declared, "The Syrian army with its finger on the trigger is united. The time has come to enter into a battle of annihilation." A week later, President Nasser of Egypt thundered, "Our basic objective will be the destruction of Israel. We will not accept any coexistence with Israel." On May 30th, he announced the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon are poised on the borders of Israel, while standing behind us are the armies of Iraq, Algeria, Kuwait, Sudan, and the whole Arab nation. The critical hour has arrived. Iraq's president thundered, "The existence of Israel is an error which must be rectified. Our goal is clear, to wipe Israel off the map." Israel has had to defend itself in 4 wars, 48, 56, 67, and 73, and after winning each one of a great cost in lives, given back most of the land it has taken in self-defense from an enemy that was sworn never to give up until it has obliterated Israel. Egyptian Foreign Minister Mohammed Salah al-Din declared the Arab people will not be embarrassed to declare, "We shall not be satisfied except by the final obliteration of Israel." Nasser said, "We demand vengeance, and vengeance is Israel's death." Such pronouncements have continued unabated in spite of Israel's sincere attempts and those of Western leaders to bring peace to the Middle East. Yet the United Nations, the European Union, and the Western leaders persist in pressuring Israel to make peace with an enemy that has sworn to destroy her. A few days after Yasser Arafat's June 8, 2001 ceasefire declaration, Sheikh Ibrahim Madhi declared on Palestinian TV, "Allah willing, this unjust state of Israel will be erased. The United States will be erased. Britain will be erased. Blessings to whoever waged jihad for the sake of Allah. Blessings to whoever put a belt of explosive on his body or his sons and plunged into the midst of the Jews." In spite of such public declarations, which should be cited by the hundreds, the UN, a veritable center for anti-Semitism and anti-Israel propaganda and action, continues to rebuke Israel for defending itself and opposing peace. Of its members, 21 are Arab nations and 52 Islamic. Israel is not allowed to be a member of UN commissions, such as the UN Commission on Human Rights, which always includes terrorists and oppressive governments that deny basic rights to their citizens. Of the UN's 189 members, 188, including every terrorist member, may take their rotation terms on the Security Council. One nation, Israel, is not allowed to do so, despite of the fact that it has been a UN member for over 50 years and is the only democracy in the Middle East. Jerusalem would not be a problem if Israel itself and the nations of the world would acknowledge that the one true God is the God of Israel and would submit to his plans for his chosen people. Instead, world and political and religious leaders continue to defy God, determined to force their agenda upon Israel. That policy can only lead ultimately to Armageddon and God's judgment upon the world, and it will. The latest proposal to end the dispute over Jerusalem and the Promised Land is called the Roadmap to Peace. It was first proposed by U.S. President Bush in his June 24, 2002 peace, and endorsed by Russian President Putin, the United Nations and European Union. The so-called Road to Peace, so long in process and paved with one Arab betrayal after another, would be a joke had it not cost so many lives. Hope is always renewed by another dream, only to be shattered, as must be the case when dealing with Islam. Arafat has never kept one provision of any agreement. Anything he signs is not worth the ink in his signature. In the 10 years before the Oslo Accords, about 200 Israelis were murdered by terrorists. In the 10 years since, more than 1,200 have been killed and some 5,000 wounded. The roadmap calls for an end to terrorism and the establishment of an independent Palestinian state with recognition of Israel's right to exist, something to which no Muslim can agree without denouncing Islam. The real stickler is Jerusalem, for which the roadmap offers no solution. No matter what the plan, the world is defying the God of Israel and will be judged accordingly. Finally, God said, "The land shall not be sold forever. The land is mine." Leviticus 25:23. But in exchange for peace with an enemy that has sworn its extermination, Israel is continually forced by Western powers to give away ever more of God's land, which he promised to her alone. Israel's actions have not been perfect, and in unbelief she has been willing to give up God's land in exchange for men's promises. As a people, worldwide, the Jews have forsaken God and have been under his judgment. Nevertheless, Scripture says of Israel, "He who touches you touches the apple of God's eye." Zechariah 2:8. It is astonishing that anyone would dare to defy the Creator of the universe, but this is what those who interfere with his plans for Israel have done. Even Christians are rejecting the hundreds of promises God has made to Israel and are trying to apply them to the church. We dare not tamper with God's word. God warns the world, "I will gather all the nations to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Then I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my inheritance, Israel. For they have divided up my land." Joel 3:2. The whole basis of the roadmap and every other peace plan proposed is to take from Israel the land God gave her. Bush, Putin, the UN, EU ought to tremble, and Christians ought to pray. So, Israel dispersed. Martin Gilbert, Exile and Return, The Struggle for a Jewish Homeland, in his book, the Jews were living in Canaan 3,000 years ago. They were first parted from their land in 722 BC with the Assyrian conquest of the northern Jewish kingdom of Samaria and the deportation of thousands of Israelites eastwards to Mesopotamia. Less than 150 years later, the Babylonians conquered the southern Jewish kingdom of Judea, together with its capital Jerusalem. The Temple of Solomon, the holiest site of Judaism, was destroyed, and the Jews once more were taken eastwards as slaves and captives to the river Euphrates. From that moment, Jewish existence was threatened in every decade, both for those who continued to live in the land of Israel and for those in exile who sought a sacred, secure haven in the ever-increasing circles of dispersion. From the towns and villages of these first dispersions, the Jews traveled throughout the known world. From the land of Israel, too, they ventured in search of a livelihood to all the ports of market towns of the civilized world, first to those of Egypt and the Persian Empire, and then to Alexander's Macedonian domains, then to the scattered city-states of ancient Greece, and to the maritime emporia of ancient Carthage. In Jerusalem itself, the temple had been rebuilt by a growing Jewish community. In 40 AD, the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria noted, "Countless multitudes from countless cities come to the temple at every festival, some by land and others by sea, from coast and from east and west and north and south." 26 years later, the Jewish historian Josephus recorded that when the Roman governor of Syria entered the town of Libya, he had found it deserted, for the whole multitude were gone up to Jerusalem for the feast of the Tabernacles. Following the eclipse of Egypt, Greece, and Carthage, the Syrian armies conquered the land of Israel. But in 168 BC, they were driven out by a Jewish revolt led by Judah Maccabee. And for 100 years, the Jews were quite again independent. But in 63 BC, the land was conquered again, this time by Roman troops, and the Jewish homeland was once again ruled by strangers. Despite the military power of Rome, Jewish independence was not easily destroyed. In 66 AD, the Jews of Judea rose in revolt, holding out in several towns and fortresses for more than 4 years. But the power of Rome was formidable, and in 70 AD, the temple was again destroyed. 3 years later, in 73 AD, the defenders of the fortress of Masada, the last stronghold to hold out, chose suicide rather than surrender. The Roman vengeance was indeed terrible. Tens of thousands of Jews were killed, many villages razed to the ground, and thousands of Jews sold into slavery.